There is, I noticed this time, even more reenactment than I noticed the first time. And, oh, how wonderful, you have your very own. Good. As someone who has just watched 150 documentaries for a panel, documentaries and the whole form of it have gotten to be so different. We are allowing, this used to be a religious experience. You couldn't do certain things. You couldn't use music. You couldn't use. Tell me about the evolution of this. And when did you enter the project?
The project started with the producer Simon Chin not getting up one Sunday morning, and he was lying in bed listening to the radio, and there's a wonderful British institution called Desert Island Discs, which is a radio show, and he heard Philippe Petit on Desert Island Discs choosing his Desert Island records, and Simon was immediately captivated, knew the producer of Desert Island Discs, got a contact, made contact with Philippe, went up to see Philippe, immediately got into Philippe's bad books because he was late, and one of the things Philippe is a stickler for is punctuality. But started a conversation with Philippe about making a documentary film about the walk, based on, or inspired by a rather wonderful book Philippe had written called To Reach the Clouds, which, if anybody hasn't seen it, they should go out and buy it, because it's one of the most wonderful, inspiring, and beautiful books, designed by Philippe, written in a very his English, which is a curious French-inflected English. Simon then came to me because we'd worked together. Came to my production company. I'd given Simon his first producing job, to talk to me about it and to tell me the story. And I think picking up on what you were saying earlier, one of our aspiration was we're wall-to-wall as a TV production company. We do we're a big independent TV production company in the UK. Do a lot in the US as well, on both sides of the west and east coast. But we'd never done any cinema. But I think our ambition for this film, or our hope for this film, was that if we made if we made a good film, and if we got lucky, it would play in cinemas. And I think the reason for that was that we felt we could make a film that was happy, that was a heist movie, that was a caper movie. We talked a lot about some of those great French caper movies, but it's also profoundly poignant. It's very infused with sadness the whole time.
But you couldn't have known that. Could you have known that at the beginning? You didn't know what these guys were going to... Was it Jean-Philippe?
Well, from meeting Philippe and from reading the book, you could we knew we could make that. There was, if we could get the conspirators, there was a it was Ocean's 11. It was a kind of documentary version of Ocean's 11. Right. And that's the film we wanted to make.
And where was James Marsh in this? When did he enter? After you?
We took a long time. We spent some time talking to Philippe and negotiating with him to option the book. And when we'd done that, we then started to talk to potential funding partners. We already had the BBC on board.
Right.
And then we started talking to directors. And I knew James's work and had met James but a while back. But by this stage, he spent the last 10 years living in New York. And so we approached James and actually had to persuade. Some of our funders took some persuading that James was the right director, which in retrospect seems slightly remarkable. And it's true that it was unlike any film James had ever made. I mean, I don't know if you've seen James's previous work, but he just made his first independent feature, which was a not very happy story of incest and religion. Wisconsin Death Trip was perhaps his best-known documentary. It's an extraordinary visual piece, but it's not an emotional film. It's not a film you love. It's an extraordinary spectacle. But we felt that James, partly because of his visual ability, was the right director, and he came on board, and then started. We pursued. Well, we didn't have to pursue very hard. We pursued. The French conspirators were all relatively easy to access. It took a lot of sleuthing to find the Americans, because there'd been a sundering, a parting of the ways between Philippe and the American
deserters.
The betrayers.
The deserters, who were such wonderful characters. I mean, what wonderful characters. Were you part of the equipe that went to New York? I mean, were you Were you slinking around corners here?
And more James and Simon than me. But
Okay.
we also, the other thing I think we did, and we knew from the outset, from the first moment we started talking to Philippe, was that we couldn't simply do a deal with him, interview him, and say goodbye, and then make a film of his story. That it was going to be a long and at times painful collaborative process.
Yes, that's what I was wondering. It seemed quite clear this guy's a soloist, no matter how many helpers he needs. He's the one out there. What was the relationship between James, the director, and the star? Contentious.
Complicated. Very, very time-consuming. But I think if Philippe was here, he would say that he would have made a very different film. And there are parts of the film that he doesn't like. I mean, he loves the fact that it's given a second lease of life to this walk, to his great walk. But he would have made a different film. There's no doubt about it.
Now,
and that took a lot of persuading. And partly some of it was that he's very punctilious about detail. You know, and for somebody who walks on a wire, you have to be. So he was very unhappy, for example, with some of the recreations, the fact that we hadn't quite got the detail right, that it was slightly the wrong cable, that in the recreations, the windows behind us, we shot some of the recreations are only the day and the evening,
the
night
stuff in the building, and on the roof of the building. How amazingly lucky that he had shot the old footage, because my suspicion is without the old footage, there would have been no center. The credibility of the center of the film would not.
No,
be
that was a complete gift. We knew that existed. That was part from the very moment go, because Philippe is a great hoarder of artifacts,
images of himself.
He has a kind of But this footage had sat unprocessed. They'd processed, I think, 2 or 3 minutes, but apart from that, it had sat unprocessed in cans for 30+ years. So we knew it existed. We didn't know quite what was there, and when we saw what was there, we were overwhelmed, because again, you know, it's Jules et Jim. You know, it's kind of it's wonderful. Yes. You know, it was a real gift.
And it's real. There's something curious going on. I don't know if many of you know about this, but Bob Zemeckis is doing this as a feature. And I had done a documentary that was then fictionalized, and it was quite clear to me from that moment that part of the magic of a documentary is that the real deal is going on. I mean, this is a great story, but if you've got the real guy, why do you need whoever on a wire with CGI? You don't need that. You've got the real thing here.
Now, we talked a lot about the recreations, and also there are 2 shots of CGI in the film, but we talked a lot about the recreations, and we felt we needed.
Which 2 shots? Which 2 shots?
The 2 shots where you look down, where you see Philippe's feet on the wire.
Okay.
But up to that point, actually earlier in the process, we had talked about whether there was. We all felt that there needed to be a moment of climax. That, you know, if you're taking people, cinema goes on this extraordinary journey, at the end you've got to give them something. And earlier on, we did think we perhaps needed to give them more. Did we need to animate some of the old archive? Did we need to animate those amazing still photos? And actually, we ended up coming down just to these 2 moments of looking down, where you look down into the abyss. But they're very short. Interestingly, in the UK, the film poster uses that as the film poster rather than a shot of Philippe. So it was marketed in the UK rather less as a documentary and more as a heist movie that just happened to be a documentary.
Wow.
So we did talk a lot about it, and I think the other thing with the recreations is we were very clear we didn't want them to. James uses the phrase that they have a certain kind of cartoon style.
Yes, he made them obvious, so that you weren't. There wasn't a question of what was real and what wasn't real. I mean,
and they're kind of 2-dimensional, but they allow you to be in the moment and to capture the moment and the tension and the joy of the evening itself.
I didn't think I had to be given anything more than Jean-Philippe's weeping. I mean, and her. I mean, the question that I come away from the film with is: do you have to wind up being a son of a bitch in order to be prodigious? And I don't know that. I mean, that's one of those bigger questions. Shall we open this up to questions here? Yes. Can you please shout?
With the World Trade Center being one of the major characters in this, was there any thought of taking Philippe to ground zero from one of the interviews? Because I always watching this,
taking him back there as a kind of documentary sequence.
Just the final interview with Ground Zero was a building that he was part of.
No, we didn't think of that as a documentary sequence because we wanted it to stay in this. You know, all the interviews are in, you know, are not field locations. They're just kind of head and shoulders. Some of them with Philippe, which actually this was Philippe's suggestion, which I think we initially shot more to kind of humour him than thinking that was him acting out. You know, him jumping up and down and acting out was actually his suggestion and worked rather wonderfully. What we did do with Ground Zero is we were fortunate enough to. For the recreations, we shot them at 7 World Trade Center, which is the completed building on the north of Ground Zero. And what was completely unnerving is that this building is still being kitted out. So when we went and did our recce there and took photos, those photos are indistinguishable from the photos that Philippe took 34 years ago.
The building, didn't you feel like you didn't know?
It was kind of method location, scouting, and filming some of the recreation there. Did it. It certainly seemed to us on the day to somehow infuse the recreations with something else because we were in the same spot in a building that was almost identical, overlooking Ground Zero. And
also, I personally felt, forgive me for this, but I at each moment, the invisible shot of the world of 9/11 was there. I mean, we carry that. We
talked a lot about. We didn't talk a lot. We didn't talk a lot about 9/11 because it was clear from us, even from the first moment Simon and I spoke, it was that the film never would mention 9/11. That it was, it was the elephant in the room. You never ever mention. So what was curious was that quite a lot of, or not, some of the reviews all said, explicitly pointed out what an extraordinary decision not to mention 9/11. Whereas it seemed to us that it was the last thing you would ever do. And in fact, we even had one discussion with James. There are 2 photographs in the book that I think are. And in the film that are completely chilling. One is the people looking up, which are the identical shots to 9/11, but here they're looking up with awe and joy. And the other one is there's one shot with a plane in the background,
which we
use, but
you use it with him on the wire.
And we use it. It just comes up and then goes. And initially, I said, we had a conversation with James, and I felt we should almost privilege that photograph, that we should stop and just have that so people would see it. And James adamantly refused to and said, no, it's just got to be another photo. And there's sort of a delayed reaction. You sort of only half realise, and what we're talking about in the film is something else, and suddenly this photo comes up and goes. And I think James is completely right, that even if we had just given that photo a moment's breath, that would have been too much, too explicit, and it's just there anyway.
I think it was there. We only have time, unfortunately, for one more question. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
It's such a good movie, and the mystery, I guess, is going to be there, but why did Jean-Louis feel so tearful with reflecting back? Have they just grown distant? Or there's a very good friend who cries so much when reflecting back on Louis.
Well, I think Jean-Louis is he and Annie were essential to the film because they provide, they're a lot of the emotion, and they're one of the I think the many things the film is about friendship and sundered friendship, and Jean-Louis and Philippe's relationship is a troubled and difficult relationship, as often happens with people who are your childhood friends. And I think he was both remembering, that moment and the friendship, and that's why he gives us that incredible emotional connection to the story.
But they remain friends even now?
I think it's fair to say that they wouldn't call each other friends now. But I think that if they were best friends now, I think it would probably have been a less interesting film. If they had continued to be, if they were seeing each other every day, I think it would have been a less interesting film emotionally.
But the film so much asks the question about what happens when you achieve that. What happens to a person? I mean, that for me, it was hugely about that. Something both happens and gets lost, which is what they say. It's just amazing. Thank you. Are
Thank
we?
you.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.